It is my pleasure and my privilege to be here to introduce a guy who I have immense admiration for. 10 years ago, Mark Meckler and a guy named Mike Ferris decided that there was a solution to the problem of Washington being too powerful. And amazingly, the solution was in plain sight, right in our Constitution in Article 5. And so few people know about this. Mark's here tonight to tell us all about this, and I am not going to waste your time listening to me, so please join me in welcoming Mark Meckler. My pleasure.
Thank you. I'm going to bring it to current politics in the United States of America aside from Israel. The country is divided. 50-50, whatever it is, 48-52. I don't know exactly what the numbers are, but our country is divided. Raise your hand if you think the country's more divided than ever before in your lifetime. Yeah, I feel that way. So the country is really divided. It's really an interesting time in American history, dangerous time in American history. Maybe, I've heard people say this, I don't disagree with this, maybe on the brink of a civil war. It's certainly already what I would call a cold civil war in America. We've got the power of the police state being used to suppress conservatives, being used to suppress Christians, being used to suppress anybody who's willing to speak out against the power of the state. It's being used now. There's one side of the political aisle that is in the favor of the use of that power to suppress our speech in America right now. That's a recipe for something to explode in the United States of America. We've seen it before. We saw it during the Civil War. It exploded, right? So the question is, what do we do about it? We live in this time in America where we're facing a choice. How do we deal with what we're facing right now? You know, we say that we live in the most divided time in the United States of America, maybe other than the Civil War. We all say it's that divided. We raise our hands very quickly. But the question we have to ask ourselves is it different today than previously in American history? It's bad, it's divided, yes, absolutely. How about the colonial era before we became a country? Everybody loved each other, everybody got along, it wasn't divided at all, right? Colonies hated each other. I mean, they really hated each other. They were like foreign countries to each other. And in fact, if you look at the colonies and what they said about each other, mostly they hated each other along Christian sectarian lines, right? And so you had the different denominations of Christianity. They would call each other blasphemers. It was like the worst thing you could say back then. Can you imagine if that's the worst thing you could say today? Please, Lord. And so this is what they were doing. They hated each other. They came together because they faced an existential threat. Right, so you have the King of England, and through the declaratory acts, he says, I'm going to impose my will on you. Parliament says, we're going to impose our will on you. And the colonies say, we're not going to allow that to happen. This is an incredible moment in human history. And so the colonies rise up and they join arms and they fight a revolutionary war. And all of you are patriots. You know the history and the story of that war. And ultimately, we win that war. It's important to note as a revolution, it's almost unique in human history because revolutions usually decide that they're going to come up, rise up, and throw off a form of government. That's the general cause of a revolution. In this case, they were trying to preserve their form of government. This was a self-governing nation. You had colonial governments, town councils. They were governing themselves mostly the way they wanted to. And the king and parliament had said, no, we're not going to let you do that anymore. We're going to choose the people. We're going to tell you when you have elections. We're going to disband town councils and colonial governments if we decide to. So all they were trying to do was preserve their form of government. Praise God, and I do mean praise God, that it's a successful revolution led by men who loved God and who believed in righteous Judeo-Christian principles because they didn't turn into tyrants, right? Because what happens in most revolutions is the very worst people win, and you go from tyranny to really bad tyranny. That's the arc of human history. The French Revolution takes place just on the heels of the American Revolution, on fraternity and all this great slogans, right? Fraternity, equality. And what happens out of the French Revolution? It's bloody. There's way more blood post-revolution than pre-revolution. Ultimately, it goes from tyranny to really bad tyranny to tyranny. That's the end of the French Revolution. That's normal in a revolution. We have this miracle that happens, right? One-of-a-kind revolution. The good news is, after the revolution, everything settles down, and the colonies become a new country, and they all just love each other. Hey, I have an excuse. I went to school in Los Angeles, California. So no, that's not what happens. They form the Articles of Confederation, which is a government for people who really, really hate each other a lot, right? Because they give nobody any power. They say, I don't like you. I don't trust you. You people up there in Rhode Island are nuts. We're not giving you any power over us. And they form a government that has absolutely no power, that doesn't work at all. It doesn't protect them against the existential threats. So in 1787, they gather again. They get together in that hall. We know the famous story. And they get in that hall because the government's not working. They know they need to do something different. They all get together. They all send a bunch of guys. They're all friends. They drink tea and they drink ale in the evenings together. Everything goes smoothly. And that's how we get the Constitution, right? They get into that hall. They hate each other. They accuse each other of all kinds of horrible things. There are people who are self-interested. There's commercial interests. It's big states against small states. It's slave states against free states. It's ugly. It's reported that 3 times the convention almost comes apart. They're screaming and yelling at each other. Franklin calls for prayer. Like, it's crazy what goes on in that hall. And out of a meeting of a bunch of men who really don't like each other, a bunch of big egos, a bunch of self-interested people, a bunch of people with different geographical interests and size state interests, what comes out of that is the finest form of government ever designed for the preservation of liberty, and that is the system of constitutional republic based on the concept of federalism. Federalism is an abused and overused word, in my opinion. And most people don't understand what it means. And in our case, what federalism means, I'm going to give you what I think should be the dictionary definition of federalism. It is a government of distributed powers designed for people who hate each other. See, because if you don't think that people in New York should tell people in Virginia what to do, then you create a government that acknowledges that we face existential threats in the world. We got to do some stuff together, but most stuff we're going to do on our own. Thank you very much. I'm from Texas. We think we should do everything on our own in Texas. So this is what we get out of it. It's incredible. Now, the good news is immediately after that convention, the entire country holds hands, sings Kumbaya, and we have the new Constitution. No, it's ugly. It's ugly. They go out there. We have the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers. People are angry. People are yelling at each other. There are factions all over the country. And by the grace of God, the Constitution is ratified in 1789. Right? Unbelievably, Rhode Island comes along a lot later. But we get the country that we have today in 1789 through the ratification of the Constitution. Now, it has this incredible calming energy on the nation, and everybody immediately loves each other, right? No, in fact, over time, the wounds that are left open from the 1787 convention are so severe, and the divisions are so severe that by 1865, we're actually engaged in a civil war. Over 700,000 people killed and maimed, brother against brother, town against town, state against state. It is a full-blown civil war. One of the ugliest in human history. And at the end, we get along so well that the victorious side, which has decimated the other side, actually forces the South into a country. It doesn't sound like we're getting along very well at that point. Now, the good news is, after the Union is saved and it's put back together, you know the history. Everybody gets along perfectly, right? No, that is not what happens. We are a fractious people. I would say we're a stiff-necked people, right? And so we continue to argue and fight over even the most basic things in the United States of America, civil rights being among them. We end slavery. We have equal protection, but all the old stuff around slavery still exists in the South at that point. Racism is endemic in the United States of America, and it takes us a long time to deal with these problems. I would argue that there's a blip in American history that's really important. That blip comes around the Second World War, and we unite during the Second World War. This is really amazing. Common theme, we face an existential threat, right? Fascism, totalitarianism rising in the world. Everybody in the country sacrifices at that point. People are recycling together. People are buying war bonds together. Everybody knows people who've gone off to war, Everybody knows people who didn't come home from the war. And we are triumphant, again, by the grace of God. We do something that I think should have been, by all accounts, impossible at the time. We fight a multi-front war. We win. After that period in American history, the GIs come home. You have the greatest, most prosperous period in American history, the 1950s. This is where we get the idea of the American dream. You get the house in the suburbs, the picket fence, the dog, the kids, all of that stuff. We're all striving for that stuff. America's not perfect by any means at that point, but we are pretty unified as a country. Some cultural things start happening. We have national radio broadcast networks. So we start gathering around the radio, 1930s, 1940s, we're all listening to the same programming. By the 1950s, it's the television. It's moving pictures, and we're all watching the same television shows. If you're in Mississippi or if you're in New York, you can all watch the same television shows. Everybody's watching The Honeymooners and stuff like that, for those of you who like old shows like I do. And so we're watching all that stuff, and it seems like our culture is pretty similar. New York, Mississippi, we watch that. You start to get the advent of national brands. You get Lucky Strike cigarettes, Borax soap. These are things now we're consuming the same products because we're consuming the same media, and it kind of feels like we're all maybe kind of the same. Get into the 1960s. I'm fast forwarding here. Into the 1960s, you get franchising. We start to get brands like that you can go into a store all across the country, McDonald's, Carl's Jr., all these different brands, hotels, Holiday Inns across the country, gas stations all across the country. By the 1960s, I can actually drive from Biloxi, Mississippi to Manhattan. And all along the way, I can stop at a brand of gas station I'm familiar with. I can buy my Lucky Strike cigarettes in every one of those gas stations. I can eat at McDonald's all along the way. And when I get to New York City, even though I'm from Biloxi, there's plenty of food I recognize. By the way, that was not true in the 1930s. But by the 1960s, that's true. It's like the culture is all becoming one, right? And then you get Major League Sports developing, late 50s, early 60s, into the 70s, Major League Baseball, Major League Football, Major League Soccer, anyone? No, just kidding. That's not American. Hockey, you get all these major league sports, right? Now we're all rooting for the same sports teams. We're all in it together. It seems like we're a monoculture. E pluribus unum is actually happening in the United States of America. By the 1970s, this is the era of unfettered big government. I've got a pop quiz for you. Who in Washington, D.C. in the 1970s was the champion of small government? Nobody. Nobody. Nobody in Washington, D.C. was saying government's too big. They were talking about economies of scale. And, you know, it's one big country and it's bigger is better. And so we get all these big agencies. You know, we get the Department of Education, the EPA come from Richard Nixon, a Republican president. Nowadays you think, oh, a Republican would never put an administrative agency in place. That comes with Richard Nixon. And so this is where we're at in the 1970s. So the country's unified. We're all together. We're all being governed from the same place, which is Washington, D.C. Sometimes when I think about the United States of America, I picture the Liberty Bell. Everybody gets that picture in their mind. You know exactly what that looks like. Big, beautiful bell with the big crack in it, right? That crack relieved the pressure when the bell was forged. That crack is necessary for that bell to stay in one piece. It couldn't stay in one piece without cracking. That's, to me, in my mind, that's like the United States of America. It's a big, beautiful country, but there's always been a fissure in this country. There's always been a crack. There's always been multiple cracks in this country, but we started to, with World War II and into all these things I told you about, we papered over that crack. So one layer at a time, paper mache, the media, the products, the sports leagues, the networks, and then it was just this beautiful e pluribus unum thing, except for in the 1960s, something happened that started to break our society apart. Vietnam War. The Vietnam War happens now. I was just a little kid. I was, 10 years old in 1972, so I don't really have many memories of the war, but I look back at the videos, and I see a lot of stuff that I see today. I see big drug problems in the country, open drug problems, people saying that it's okay, that all these crazy drugs that people are doing, weed, psychedelic drugs, all this stuff is okay. We see, if you look back at the pictures, half-naked people with body paint. Now they don't even bother to put body paint on, right? But that's what we see in the streets. We saw riots in the streets, people throwing Molotov cocktails at police officers. Feels exactly like the summer of love in 2020, right? Seems a lot alike. So that all starts back then. Our society continues to schism underneath, even though government continues to govern us more and more from Washington, D.C. That schism is there, and the paper mache is ripping. And so we come to where we're at today. I'll just be blunt again where I'm at. So I'm a 61-year-old white male Christian Tea Party Bible thumping gun toting guy. That's who I am. I appreciate that, but I promise you it gets a different response in San Francisco. About that point, I'm calling for security. So that's where I come from. I look at what's going on out in the country, and I probably would have looked at it the same in the 1960s during the Vietnam War, and I think, what in God's name is going on? I don't recognize this country. I look at it now, and I look at it like this. I go, well, it's not just abortion should be safe, fair, and legal, which is bad enough. It's shout your abortion till 9th month and maybe beyond. That's evil. That's not just bad. That's evil, right? So I look at that. That's what I see. I look at, they're trying to teach our young kids that men are women, women are men, both are neither. You're born however you are, and gender is fluid, except for there are 157 genders. I don't even know what it means, but I know it's crazy, and it's not just bad, it's evil. They're trying to say and legislate that you can chemically castrate young children. Children who are not old enough to buy cigarettes, drive, or vote, but they're allowed to choose their gender. They're trying to tell us that you should teach kids this stuff in school. There's pornography in our schools. And they're also telling us, by the way, that it's really important that you judge people by the color of their skin and not the content of their character. And I look at that and I look out at the country and I think, I don't even know if I can live in a country with those people. I don't even know if I want to live in a country with those people. Just being honest with you, that's what I feel. But there's a flip side to that. Flip that coin over, and I know a lot of these people, and you talk to people on the left, and they would look at somebody like me saying the things that I've said here tonight, and they would say, that guy is a white supremacist. That guy is a racist. That guy's a misogynist. That guy's an Islamophobe, a homophobe, an everything phobe, right? In fact, let's just simplify it and say he's a Nazi. And then they would say, I'm not sure I want to live in a country with a guy like that, people like that. I'm not sure I can live in a country with people like that. So that brings us to where we're at. We all agreed that the country is entirely divided. So what do you do in a divided country like this? Well, we have a couple of choices. One is that we secede. Now, I'm from Texas. We like secession in Texas. But it's not real. States don't have the right to secede, and even if they could, it's only violent. That's the only way you're going to ever be able to secede is violent secession. And you know, I'm from Texas, which is a good red state, Texas. It's, well, except for Austin, where I live. It's not exactly red in Dallas, San Antonio, Houston, El Paso. Yeah, it's a red state with a bunch of big blue population areas in it. So how do you secede in a case like that? Like, we're going to be a conservative state. You know, I guess some of my really conservative friends, they say we could kick out all the liberals. I mean, I like that idea, but I just don't think it's practical. So secession isn't real. It's not going to work. That's not going to happen. I'm from California originally. 85% of the geography of California is red. Like, if you look at a map, 85% geographically is red. These big blue population centers, LA, San Francisco, unfortunately more and more San Diego, big population centers. So what do? How do you divide that state? There's no Mason-Dixon line anymore. There's no place north-south. There's no place west-east where you can divide the United States of America. So dividing us up doesn't work. I know. I hear this all the time from people on the right. My friends, right? People on the right will say, the tree of liberty must be watered from time to time with the blood of tyrants and patriots. All we need is a good revolution or a good civil war. Any combat veterans in this audience? Raise your hand if you've seen combat. Does that sound like a good idea to you? No. I've talked to a lot of veterans. I'm not brave enough. I don't have the honor of saying that I've served, but I know a lot of people have, and I know a lot of people that have been in combat. And if you say that to them, I'll tell you what I generally hear. They look at me with a really steely look in their eyes, and they say, you're out of your freaking mind. You have no idea what that looks like. You don't know what you're talking about. If you want to know what that looks like, look at Israel right now. Dead women, children, carnage, starvation, destruction. Look at the videos from Ukraine. You can actually see this stuff online if you have the stomach for it. So if any of your friends tell you, oh, all we need is a civil war, we'll beat them down. I got lots of guns. Look, it's good to have lots of guns. I like that. But we don't need a civil war in this country. And for those of us who are great patriots, and I count everybody in this audience among those great patriots, if you believe in the one true God, then you don't believe that this is what we should do. I'm not saying it won't come to that, because that's not up to us. Right? Ultimately, God has his hand on everything that happens, but I'm saying we have an obligation to do everything we can to avoid that. So if it's not secession, if it's not revolution or civil war, then what's the solution? We're a divided country. Thank God for the framers of the United States Constitution, because they gave us a tool to prevent the problems that we're having today, to fix the problems that have come upon us. One of the most important days in American history is September 15th. Most of you are sitting there like, I don't know, September 15th. That one's not familiar to me. Fill me in, Mark. September 15th is my wife's birthday. If I forget that one, promise you, it's one of the most important days in American history. But it is also the day on which Colonel George Mason stood up, September 15th, 1787. He addresses the men assembled in the hall there in Independence Hall. They're drafting the Constitution. It's almost done. They're 2 days before the end of convention, and he says, we blew it. We have a problem. We drafted a document that gives the power to Congress to propose amendments, but we didn't give that same power to the people acting through the states. And he asks the question, are we so naive that we believe that a government that becomes a tyranny will ever propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny? I always hear somebody chuckles in the audience. I think they laughed in Independence Hall. I think they just started laughing because it's ridiculous. No tyrant in human history has ever said these words. I think I have a little too much power and we need to give some back. It's not the nature of tyranny, and he knew that the states would have to act, and we know what the people in that hall did. We don't have a videotape of them laughing, but we have Madison's notes, which in that point say these two small Latin abbreviations, nin com, and stands for no comment. Not one person debates, not one person argues, and unanimously they agree to put the second clause of Article 5 in that gives you, all of us, through our state legislatures, the power to call a convention to propose amendments to take power of Washington away from Washington, D.C. and give it back to the people. Does that sound good to anybody? So we have the power, so you would think we would use it. The framers would be appalled. Sometimes I imagine myself sitting with Ben Franklin. He's one of my favorite framers. He was just a cantankerous old dude. He was the oldest guy at the convention. I think he was 81 years old at the time of convention. That was really old back then. He'd been all over the world. He was well-read, well-spoken. He was a scientist, really smart guy, very practical guy. I imagine sitting down with him and telling him about all the bad things that are going on. Ben, they control our healthcare system. They're putting all these naked pictures in our libraries. He might have been used to that. He spent a lot of time in France, so I'm not sure about that one. But I'm telling him all the problems we're having, all the government overreach, and I imagine Franklin saying, well, what about Article 5? I mean, you've called a convention, the states have gotten together, we've pushed back, and you guys have taken some of that power away from them, right? And I imagine how bad I would feel in that moment. Well, no, Ben, no. And he would say, well, why not? And I would say, well, Ben, it's hard. It's hard. It's really hard to do this. He'd be like, son, we fought a revolution. People died for this cause so that you would have the right to do this. And you're telling me it's hard? Well, it's also been, there's people who believe in liberty like you and I do, Ben, but they say it's too scary. It's dangerous. And imagine him slamming down his cup of ale and saying, I can't even listen to this anymore. Feel free to give me a call after you've called a convention and used Article 5 and tell me how it goes. I think they'd be appalled that we haven't done it by now. I think they'd be stunned. They had no income tax. They had no federal register. They didn't even tell them how much water they could use to flush their toilets. They didn't have flush toilets. And so I think they would be appalled that we haven't done it now. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, do we have the courage to call a convention of states? Let me tell you exactly how it works. According to Article 5, it takes 2/3 of the states to call a convention of states. They call a convention of states by getting together in their state legislature. No governors necessary, no courts, no president, no Congress. And the legislature passes what's called a resolution or a call and says, hey, we'd like to have a convention of states. In the case of our organization, we're calling for that convention to discuss three things. Anything that would impose term limits on the federal government. Does that sound good to anybody? Not just on Congress, but on bureaucrats and staffers. I call it the Fauci Amendment. Right? This guy shouldn't be there 40 years. Anybody think that the federal government is financially out of control? How about a balanced budget amendment? How about limitations on taxes, limitations on spending? Here's one. The federal government has no standards by which they measure their finances. And that sounds weird. If you've ever been in business, you're required to, a church is required to use what are called generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP. Right? There's a finance team here. They use GAAP principles to track all of their accounting. I was at the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, one time, sitting around with a bunch of high muckety-mucks there, and I said, I understand you guys don't use GAAP, so what kind of principles do you have? And they said, well, we don't have any principles. I said, no, I understand that. I meant accounting principles. So how about we impose GAAP on the federal government? Finally, how about we take some power away from them? The last subject matter of our call is anything that would impose scope or jurisdictional restraints on the federal government. The federal government originally had 17 enumerated powers in the Constitution, 17 things that the federal government was allowed to do. I counted last week, it's now 17,287,000. Okay, I didn't actually count, but it feels like that, right? And so how about we push them back into the constitutional box? This is the way I like to say it, just because it's emotionally satisfying to me. Would you like to join me in getting your hands around the throat of the federal government and shoving it back in the constitutional box? Anybody in for that? No more Department of Education, no more Department of Energy, no more USDA, no more FDA, no more DEA. All of these things, the states have all of these departments. Why do we need the federal government in our business? Can Indiana do those things on its own? Of course you can. Too much, I might add. But we know how to do all those things in the states, and the federal government shouldn't have and doesn't have and should never have been given the right to do these things. Most of these things granted by the courts of the United States of America in contravention of the very Constitution upon which we rely, the law of the land, which says that all lawmaking authority is in Congress. They can't delegate it to these agencies. They've done it, and the courts have allowed it, and we got to stop it. Are you with me? So we have the ability to do this. When 34 states call for a convention, 2/3 of the states will gather. They'll send a delegation from each state. Each state has one vote. Rhode Island has the same power in convention as Indiana or Texas. It's a convention of states, not a convention of delegates. They'll get together in convention. They'll debate things in these three subject matter areas. They'll come up with one amendment or a slate of amendments. If you want to see what this looks like, Convention of States did a simulation in Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg, just a few months ago. That's online at conventionofstates.com. They'll propose amendments, and then those amendments go out to the states for ratification. It takes 38 states to ratify anything. So this is the last thing I'm going to say about the Convention of States, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. I went way too long. I'm sorry about that. So I hear from people all the time, people on our side, I would say conservatives, people on the right, and they'll say to me, well, Mark, I'm really worried because what happens if there's a runaway convention? Who knows what they're going to do in that convention? We have no idea. Well, no, we do have an idea because it takes 34 states saying what the limitations of convention are. Anything else is not germane to that convention. What if they do anyway? What if the convention gets completely out of control? And I say, so? What happens? Maybe they'll propose repealing the Second Amendment. Now, first of all, I find that highly offensive. We're big gun folks in my family. We love our guns. My mom was a cop and then a sheriff's deputy. My son's a Marine. We like our firearms a lot. And so I'm not worried about the Second Amendment because, first of all, remember, anything that comes out of convention is a suggestion. Have you ever been to a meeting and thought, oh my God, people are going to make suggestions? I'm so scared. People are just going to make suggestions. That's the only power of a convention of states, is to make suggestions. And then it has to go out to the states for ratification by 38 states. Now, I went to school, Los Angeles, California. I keep using that as an excuse, but I did learn basic math, okay? I can add and subtract pretty well. If it takes 38 states to ratify an amendment, that means it takes only 13 states to stop an amendment, right? So only 13 states. So let's talk Second Amendment in particular. Currently today, I'm proud to say in the United States of America, 27 states have constitutional carry. You don't need a permit. Carrying a gun is your constitutional right. That's good. Not enough, but that's very good. And it's been rising over the last several years. I think Florida was the last state to enact constitutional carry. There are actually 24 states where you can take your handgun, loaded, one in the chamber, and walk into your state legislature in the Capitol. By the way, in Texas, we actually have a fast pass lane. If you're carrying a gun, you don't have to wait in line. That's the real deal. I'm not kidding. Yeah, so there's a reason I love Texas. That's one of them. There are 14 states where you can take an AR, put one in the chamber, rack it, throw it across your back, carry it in a sling, walk into your legislature, sit in the gallery, and watch the proceedings. Now, I'm not saying that's a good idea. I'm not promoting that. I'm just saying you can do that in 14 states. So now you tell me, just logically speaking, are you going to find 38 states that are going to ratify the repeal of the Second Amendment? That's a ridiculous fever dream fantasy argument, and people use it against Convention of States, and you shouldn't buy into that. You know better. You're smart people. Ben Franklin, the framers of the Constitution, the founders of this country, and everybody who has signed the dotted line, giving their life, putting their lives on the line to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, are counting on you right now. We have to do something. We have a duty to do something. I think it's a sacred duty. I think we as people of faith, the people of the one true God, we understand duty. A lot of people in America have forgotten what it means to have a duty. Duty is what you do when nobody else is watching. Duty is what you do when you know you're going to take punishment for doing the right thing, but you do it anyway. Duty is what you do when you don't want to do it because it's not pleasant, but you just know that you should because it's the right thing. That's duty. John Quincy Adams was president of the United States, a one-term president, and after he was president, he went back and he served in the House of Representatives. That's hard to understand. You've been the president, the head honcho, the chief poobah, and now you're going to go get elected to Congress and be a backbencher? But John Quincy Adams believed one thing so firmly that it kept him serving, and that was that slavery was a stain upon the United States of America. He was a hardcore abolitionist. In Congress, he was known as the hellhound of abolition. He was just, there's nothing else he cared about. There's nothing else he wanted to talk about. And he spent 17 years in Congress, 17 years, and the only thing he would talk about was abolition. He didn't want to talk about anything else. In fact, they found him so annoying, they passed the John Quincy Adams Censure Act, which said that if John Quincy Adams went on the floor of the House of Representatives and talked about abolition, that they would hold a 5-day censure trial. He found that very appealing because he got to talk about abolition for 5 more days. He was a difficult man. He died on the floor of the House of Representatives, had a stroke. It's now in Statuary Hall. There's a plaque where he actually fell. And shortly before he died, he was interviewed by a journalist. The journalist asked him, why do you keep doing what you're doing? Nobody favors abolition. Nobody wants to hear from you. Basically, you're just an annoyance. Why do you keep doing it? And John Quincy Adams said, duty is ours. The results belong to God. Duty's ours, the results belong to God. I love that. It says where we're at right now. We don't have an obligation to win, but we do have an obligation to fight. We don't have an obligation to be successful in calling a convention of states, but we have an obligation to fight for it. We don't have an obligation to rescue the country, but we have a duty to try to rescue our country. Sometimes it seems as though we're failing. We're in dark times right now. Sometimes it can feel like we're failing. John Quincy Adams, when he died, maybe he felt like he had failed. Slavery was still part of the fabric of the United States of America. But during his last term, he was serving with a young congressman, and that congressman was so enamored that John Quincy Adams was in Congress, the great president, John Quincy Adams, that he followed him around. He asked to be mentored by him. He learned everything he could learn from him. He learned about John Quincy Adams' 3-part plan for abolition. In fact, they became such close friends that this young congressman was asked to be one of the pallbearers at John Quincy Adams' funeral. Quite an honor. And they had a fairly young friendship. And that congressman at the time got called home after his term was over. Back then, there weren't even primaries. You couldn't just decide to run. The party decided who ran. And so he was told by his party, come home, you can't run again. He didn't like that. He actually thought he was pretty good in Washington, D.C., but they didn't want him there anymore. So he went home, and a couple of years later, he convinced them to let him run again, and he ran and he lost. And he ran again, and he lost. The third time he ran, he won. You and I know him as the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln. And the reason I tell you that story, the reason why that story is so important to me, and I keep it so close to my heart, is because John Quincy Adams in his lifetime lost. He lost. He didn't see emancipation. He didn't even see a bill come out of a committee that could be debated on the floor for emancipation, but he knew his duty, and he did his duty to God and to his country and to his fellow man. That's what John Quincy Adams did. And that's what I'm asking you to do, is to look in the mirror when you go home tonight, to pledge your life, your fortune, and your sacred honor to your fellow warriors, to your church family, to anybody that's in this fight with you. Know your duty and never quit. God bless you guys. Thanks for having me tonight. All right, we're going to do some questions.
All right.
Isaac's in charge of the mic. Be nice to him or he won't come your way.
That's right. And because I'm in charge of the mic, I'm going to ask the first few questions.
Oh, do it. Let's go.
Well, one of the parallels I thought was neat was you told in your story at the beginning that how you are a Jewish man who basically believes in the promise of the Messiah. And you get up here and then transform that into that you are an American who believes in the Constitution. Like, really, that parallel struck me about how hard you fight for that. And to say, you know what, that, and I've heard that argument to say that, oh, you're not democratic to try to do this convention of states. And that's what you tell people, though, is that you are enforcing the Constitution when people say that. So how is the convention of states going? How are we doing on the number of states?
So it takes 34 states to call a convention. So far, 19 states have called for the convention, so we're well over halfway. It's an impossible project. I mean, this is what I was told from the beginning. Nobody will do this. So we've gotten to 19 states so far. I would say openly, it's hard. It's a steep hill. Getting to 34 states is not going to be easy, but duty is ours, results belong to God. So that's where we're at. I think we have one state that's really right on the cusp, and that's Kansas. Kansas is kind of a weird situation. We passed in Kansas. They have a state constitutional provision that requires a 2/3 majority vote. That provision is unconstitutional because it contradicts the U.S. Constitution. So we're going to have to litigate that. I think we're going to win that litigation. I think that'll be number 20.
Awesome. Thank you. The second question that I have, what do you think the federal government's going to do when we call the Convention of States?
I think before we get to convention, they're going to start debating amendments in Congress. I think Congress we've seen this in history, by the way. The 17th Amendment, which I don't love, the direct election of senators, Congress proposed that because the states had come close twice to calling a convention. And so Congress likes to control the game, human beings, right? And so as we get close, I think you'll see them start to propose some kind of term limit, some kind of balanced budget amendment, all the things that we're talking about, some limitations on their power. Our position is, that's really, well, I'm going to say it in Texas terms. Bless their hearts. I mean, it's great if they want to, and they're welcome to make suggestions to the convention, but we're going to go forward with convention no matter what they do.
Awesome. So it's worth the fight. Even if we don't win ultimately, it's worth the fight anyway.
Absolutely.
Awesome. And then the final question I have for you is, well, what does fighting look like on practical terms? Like, what can these people right here, what can they do?
So I'm going to start at the macro, which is really close to home, and I think this might be the hardest part of the fight. We live in a time where everything's at stake, and I hear people say all the time, this is a common one I hear, and I apologize if this is your family and this is difficult for you, but I hear people say, my kids are liberals, and so we just don't talk politics. Ben Franklin's son was a Tory. Right? So they were torn apart by the American Revolution. It didn't stop Ben from professing his ideals. your kids, they might not hear conservative values from anybody but you. And they might not want to visit as much anymore, or maybe at all. I have one aunt who is now, as far as I know, disabled and in the latter stages of her life. I say as far as I know, because when I started leading the Tea Party movement, she decided that I was a Nazi and started attacking our family and writing op-eds in our small town newspaper. I took my kids out to the movies one night and told them how evil what their parents were doing, and we had to separate from that's my one aunt. She was 13 when I was born. She was my first babysitter. We have to be willing to pay the price for saying what's right and true. And so that might mean, look, this church is an incredible example of this. You guys have a foundational example because most churches nowadays in America are not speaking the truth to the world, right? I mean beyond the gospel truth, I mean the political truth to the world. We are guided by our principles, which are biblical principles, which cannot be separated from our politics. So that means this church takes a risk by speaking political truth and by having somebody like me come speak. So you have to do it in your family. I'm going to say politically incorrect things. You need to do it at your place of work. And what that means is you might lose your job. You might. And it's easy for me to say, I'm going to acknowledge this because I'm paid to do this. I can say the controversial thing, and this is my job. For you, it's not your job, and you might be ostracized at work. You might be disciplined at work, and you might be fired at work. Some of my biggest heroes right now in the United States are people who said no to the COVID shot and lost their jobs, right? They spoke the truth. They weren't willing to be imposed upon. That's super hard. Their lives are not easier because they did this. So you've got to be willing to be the person at your bridge group that when somebody says, well, I think in Israel has been a colonial power forever, and you got to be able to say, no, that's not true. This is terrorism we're talking about. Are you a Nazi? Do you support? And you know what's going to happen? You're not going to be invited for bridge next week. So this is a real deal. This is not easy stuff. I make light of it, but that's not easy. That's a big deal when you get ostracized from friends, family, work. You don't have this problem here, but in a lot of churches, you can't talk this way, and you're going to be ostracized from your church. So we have to be willing to take those risks and to do those things. And then more broadly, what else are you going to do? This is one I hear all the time, Isaac. I would love to help, but I'm so busy, right? I get it. That's not untrue. I mean, you're a dad, you got kids, right? You're obviously engaged heavily here at the church. We've got jobs, families, church obligations, coaching, kids, grandkids. I always ask people the question, okay, so what is it that you wouldn't do for your kids? What wouldn't you, if I put it that way, what wouldn't you do for your kids? You can't give 5 hours for your kid's future, 10 hours a week for your kid's future, right? Give up your model train hobby or whatever it is, right? I know it's hard. Again, I don't mean to minimize this. All of this stuff requires that we make sacrifices. We live in a generation when most of us have not been asked to sacrifice for our country. I talked to my father-in-law before he passed away. He was a World War II vet, a Bronze Star recipient. He understood what it meant to sacrifice for his country. And most of us don't because we've just never been asked. It's not because we're bad people or we're lazy, or it's just we haven't been in that moment. One of my favorite Ronald Reagan quotes, he has so many of them and so many memorable ones. One of my favorite ones is one that's not very remembered. I actually have this plaque in my office, and it says, "They say we live in a time when there are no heroes, but they just don't know where to look." And he went on in that speech to talk about the hero is the guy standing on stage next to me. The hero is your pastor. The hero is your grocery clerk. The hero is the person who works wrenches on your truck when your truck breaks down. Heroes rise according to circumstances. If there's no call to heroics, then the most heroic people don't look like heroes to you. They just look like your neighbor or something. We are in a time where we are being called to be heroes. And what heroism looks like right now is speaking up, is working when nobody else is working, is volunteering for Convention of States. We have a table out there. You can volunteer for Convention of States. It's giving money that you feel like you can't afford to give. And I always tell people, you know how you know you've given too much? You're thinking, man, I really can't afford this. That's how you know that you've maybe given enough when you get to that point. And so do all of those things. Work for candidates, give money to candidates, knock on doors, be block walking, making phone calls for them, and do get involved in Convention of States. Convention of States, way more than just Convention of States. We're involved in elections. We're involved in pro-life activity. We're involved in Second Amendment activity. Anything that bolsters freedom and helps us build a self-governing grassroots army, that's what we're involved in.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. All right, so I'm going to walk around and take questions. Do not take the microphone from me. I'm going to keep holding it, all right? Just in case I can cut you off in a political rant, all right? But I'll do it politely. I really will. Yeah, we're open to questions right now, and yeah, feel free to, by hands. Okay.
I love it when it's somebody right here in the front row.
She's a good one, too, I'll tell you.
I hope my question makes sense. With 2024 being such a critical election, are we running out of time to get these things done? Because if we want to have term limits, we've got to do it now. Otherwise, our next president will run away with what he's doing already now.
Yeah, look, I think this is a great question, and I get this question in one form or another all the time. Do we have enough time to call a convention of states? Like, is it too late? I think that's a great question and very reasonable. And my answer is, I have no idea. I mean, I really have no idea. And the reason I say that is because I don't know what happens 5 minutes from now, 5 days. People come up to me, this is a normal thing that happens to me at events as an aside. Very often, especially in a church, somebody will approach me after I speak and they'll say, have you read Revelation? Yeah, of course I've read Revelation. You see what's going on in Israel, right? And they'll start to lay out their map of end times and when it's coming and here's the date. And I always say, first of all, I know I'm not supposed to know. The Bible tells me that. I don't know. And the Bible tells me that I'm supposed to be an overcomer at all times, right? And for me, the message of Revelation is it's going to get really bad, and my job is to be steadfast and be an overcomer, right? That's all. And so that would be my answer to you about Convention of States. I don't know if we get it done in time. I do know that everything that we're doing in Convention of States works towards election success. In other words, our grassroots, people talk about likely voters. I can guarantee you in the Convention of States Army nationally, over 5 million people, there are 5 million voters, not likely voters, right? Every person who's involved in this project is going to vote, and they're going to get their friends to vote and their families to vote, and they're going to be poll watchers, and they're going to be block walkers. And so what I would say is, whether or not we get to convention, we're building the largest self-governing grassroots army in the history of the country, and we have to do that if we're going to save America. Yeah. Great question.
So I would like you to elaborate a little bit more on how you guys are exciting other states to be a part of this full-heartedly and to join the list that's on the back of the pamphlet.
Sure. So there's, in our sort of pantheon of states, we've got two kinds of states. We've got what we call past states, like Indiana, states that have already passed the Convention of States resolution, and states that have yet to pass, which are states that are potential, what we would call harvest states for Convention of States. Every state matters. I mean, this is really interesting. I have people say to me, oh, California, like seriously. And whatever disdain you have for California, you're correct, first of all. I'm not going to defend California. Do you know that California has more registered Republicans than any state in the United States of America? Like, that's wild, more than Texas. Right? That's crazy. It's a big state. And so even smaller numbers proportionally are huge numbers. So part of what we're trying to do, that's what I would describe as a blue state. And blue states like New York or New Jersey or California, we encourage people to get involved in Convention of States because, good Lord, what else are you going to do? Right? California has a supermajority of Democrats in the legislature. The legislature is not going to be responsive immediately to Convention of States, but you know who is? City councils, school boards, county governments. 85% of the geography of California is red, but the people who are conservative like us don't control all that geography. They don't control all the levers and layers of government in all of those places. So in places that are more blue, what I'm trying to encourage people to do is get involved in the local fight. And we'll work towards Convention of States with those folks, but be involved at the city, state, and county level and the school board level in those places. in states like Indiana that have passed, that's equally important, by the way. We should be working together to take school boards, to take city councils and county boards. It would blow your mind how many cities in Indiana or counties in Indiana that are conservative by population and have liberal governance. It's stunning, right? And it's because we haven't paid attention to that, and the left has. And so in a state like Indiana, I encourage people to do the same thing. Also in Indiana, what I'm encouraging people to do is be prepared for rescission efforts. This is true in any state where we've passed. That application can be rescinded at any time by the state legislature. We get people who come into the legislatures. We had a big rescission effort in Alabama in this session, and we fought that off. So we have to be prepared for that. Also, for state teams like Indiana, we help other states. So in other words, if we've got stuff going on in Ohio, which we do right now, for example, the Indiana team will be involved in making calls into Ohio and helping us move things forward in Ohio. In Ohio right now, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, they're trying to make abortion legal all the way through 9 months. They're trying to make pot legal all the way through forever. No 9-month limitation on pot, right? They're trying to make it so that every person can grow 12 plants. By the way, that's about $185,000 in income to anybody who grows 12 plants a year. They're trying to destroy their state, so we work in other states to help with that. So we use that, the ability to help other states and work out of states, to enthuse people in all the states.
Hi, Mark. I'm a member of the grassroots, and what you see right here is pretty much the state leadership team of COS in Illinois. We really appreciate our brothers and sisters.
God bless you guys for coming.
In Indiana. I am actually that stiff Jew.
Me too.
I'm observant in my Judaism. I'll be doing morning services tomorrow at 8 a.m.
Thank you.
And I read, oh gosh, my mind's gone blank. The Bible books, Dennis Prager, thank you. My wife.
The best.
I read Dennis Prager, and this is more a comment than a question, Mark, but I'm 75 years old. I may not see the convention in my lifetime. But my analogy is Moses never got to the promised land. That said, I work very hard, and my dear wife refers to COS as my 7-day-a-week, 24-hour-a-day, unpaid job, and it's my passion.
Thank you, and God bless you. Before you go to the next question, I can't recommend it highly enough. Those Prager books are amazing. And that's what you just said, the Moses story. That's what Prager says about the Moses story in those books, right? He says that it is a model for us to show us that from an earthly perspective, most of us never make it to the promised land, right? Moses was not allowed into the promised land. I mean, this is extraordinary. He goes on to say in that chapter of the book that the closest most of us on earth will ever get to the promised land, if your parents and you're blessed like we've been, you'll know this, is when you have grown children and they got their careers and they're happy and healthy and married and maybe have kids. That's as close as parents get to the promised land, right? But I think this is really important, and I can't recommend it highly enough. If you want to have a foundation in your faith, Jew or Christian, there are no better books that I've ever read in my life than Prager's books on Torah. And 5 books of the Torah, he's written 3 of them so far. What's that? The Rational Bible is what it's called. And they're very rational. Dennis has, as an observant Jew, with a great respect for Christians and an incredible dialogue with the Christian community. I had a chance to sit down with him for dinner one-on-one not long ago. Total bucket list item for me to sit with Dennis Prager and ask him. I told him that I'm waiting for the next book because I've read the first 3, and he complained that I was putting too much pressure on him. So just know the next one's coming out soon. I think it's supposed to be out, I think he said October of this year. I don't know if he's on it. I'll text him afterwards, and I'll tell him you and I are waiting for it. Isaac, we've got somebody over here, too.
David had a question.
Go
real
ahead,
quick.
David.
Mark, thanks for being such a great leader of our organization. My question is, could you comment why Nancy Pelosi said about 2 months ago, please trust us, we'd like to implement some term limits? Is it showing up on their polling data, or why would such a lady say such a statement?
Well, if I had to guess, her term limit's going to be that everybody terms out of office when they're 112 years old, right? And she'll fake her age because I think she's already past that. No, I think it is showing up in her polling data. I think they're realizing. By the way, this is polled for 35 years. We've polled term limits in the American public. Not we as in me or our organization, but it's been consistently polled. The American people, about 85% of the American people are in favor of term limits on Congress. One quick thing I want to say about term limits on Congress: if you watch our Williamsburg experiment, and they talked about term limits, came out with a proposed term limits, and so I'm just going to do a quick test on the audience. They said 24 years is the appropriate term limit. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? All right, but now this is why I'm doing that test. So I think that sounded terrible, and they had some technicalities in there. It was 9 terms in the House. It was 4 terms in the Senate. Total time in the House and Senate not to exceed 24 years. That's the way they couched it. And so I talked to some of the folks that were there. Most of them are state legislators. I'm like, this is ridiculous. That's way too much. And they said, okay, Mark, who do you want to term out? You tell me who annoys you that you would want to term out. And my answer was like Pelosi, McConnell, Schumer, right? So the big names, all the ones that we know. And they said every single one of those has served well more than 24 years. And the reality is there's much more turnover in the Senate and the House than we recognize. We just happen to pay attention to the big names, the ones that have been there forever. 24 years would wipe out all those people I just named and a lot more that you might think of. And they said there's knowledge or value in institutional knowledge. I'm not saying I agree with them, but I'm saying sometimes when we look at something on the surface and we just react, oh, that's terrible, 24 years. After talking to those guys, I'm like, oh, I get what you're saying. Because every one of those names, that's who I'm thinking of when I'm thinking of term limits. I'm not thinking of some guy that's been there for 5 terms, 10 years. I mean, look at our new Speaker of the House. He's on his 5th term right now, I think. Right? And so that's not what I'm thinking of when I'm thinking of term limits. Anyway, that's... So Nancy Pelosi, I actually think what's going to happen to her is God's probably going to end her term before we do.
All right, Mark, I want to respect everyone's time, so one more question from the audience here.
I'm in Northwest Indiana. I'm not, unfortunately, here in this area. And I'm so frustrated with the Republicans in my area. The lack of what they're doing. They're satisfied with, we know what the Democrats are doing, so, and their organization and everything. So it's like they don't do anything to help. Like, I ran for school board a year ago.
Thank you.
I had no one from the Republican Party help me. No one. I was totally on my own. There's a young man that's running right now for our town board. We had a meeting, our town Republican meeting, and they barely even mentioned it. And I have been going for a couple of years to the Republican meeting, and I even go to other township Republican meetings to say, hey, can't you help? Tell us when to put up signs. Where do we get signs? How do we go to these doors? How do we get people to commit to help us? Just any way in helping. But they're just like, nothing. And what do I do to get rid of these leaders and to bring in? And another thing is, a few people have come to the Republican meeting because they took. I teach the Rick Green's class.
Thank you. Love that.
A couple of the people from that class have come to our meeting, and there's so nothing to do. And that they've stopped coming. And I
Right.
say, don't stop coming, keep putting the pressure on. But they give up. I don't know what else to do. I'm so frustrated.
Yeah, so this is a problem all over the country, by the way. I travel, I've been in 49 states now, all over the country. I speak at a lot of stuff like this. Sometimes I speak at Republican events. Here's something I've never heard. The Republican Party in my area is awesome. Never heard that. Okay? Now, I'm sure it exists somewhere. Sorry if you're a member of a county committee or something that's really awesome. Maybe they exist, but I haven't run across them. And so here's what I'll tell you. What you have to do is what you're doing, but the beginning end game, the first goal, is to take over your county committee. Like you need to run your county committee. And it's not actually that hard to do. It takes time and work, but it's not complicated. You probably know technically how to do it at this point. One of the things that I have found out is, and we do this all over the country now because I found this out, most precinct chair positions, or a very lot of them, are empty. Nobody runs for them, right? And so the first thing is to start stuffing your people into precinct chair positions. It's the rules of how to do that in every place are different. I don't know the rules here. I can tell you we're making a big effort in the biggest county in Texas right now, Harris County. What was that? So they may be rigged, but I'm telling you, if you get enough people, you can take over a county party. We've done it all over the country. Over their objections, it can be ugly. You can end up in total warfare with these folks. And I understand that there's a lot of rigging going on. And we can talk about any particular place and how I might be able to help, because I'd be happy to try and help in any given place. But here's the thing, not every one of them is rigged, right? And what they are mostly is what you described. They're mostly lazy people that are involved in a social club. And it's the same people, and they've been doing it for 20 years, and they get together and have lunch or whatever they do once a month, and they don't do anything. And when a bunch of people with energy come in, generally speaking, I have found that you're able to take them over if you make a plan and you bring a bunch of people with you. We've got this going on right nearby where I live right now in Georgetown. There's a great woman named Deborah Damon, and I'd be happy to introduce you to her. And she is sort of surreptitiously taking over the county party there. She's over 50% right now. She's not running for chair because she wants somebody else to stand up, and she'll continue the organizing. But I would say within a year, they will own that county party, and that's a model for us in Texas, because we got the same problem all over Texas. And a lot of times they rig the elections, they fix the way people get nominated, they control the precinct chair applications. There's all kinds of things that they do to control it if they want to keep you out. But in most cases, with enough muscle and grassroots, we found that we can force our way in, and I highly recommend that you do that. Yeah, so it works all over the country. I'm going to close with something, if I could, before you close out the evening.
Yeah, of course.
I briefly used the phrase earlier, lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. Rick Green, a lot of you know who Rick Green is. He teaches biblical citizenship. He's way smarter than me, knows way more about the Constitution than I do. And I was just out at Patriot Academy shooting with him. He's also a way better shot than I am. I'm humiliated to say. I'm working on that. I've taught Rick Green one thing, and it's this story. And he gives me credit for it. I really appreciate that, because I admire him so much. He's such a good friend of mine. Next to my desk on the wall, when I sit looking at my screen, up on the left is a Declaration of Independence. It's beautiful. It's hand calligraphied. I mean, literally the one I have, a really good friend of mine had it made for me, a woman in Texas. Hand calligraphies the whole thing. Takes her about 3 days to do the document. It's just beautiful. On parchment, it's spectacular. When he first gave it to me, it's my friend Tim Dunn I was describing earlier. What I didn't realize is that he had my signature put on there. It's pretty cool, huh? I know I don't look that old. My signature's on there, Patty's signature on there, he and his wife, and a couple other people that we've worked together in politics with. It really means a lot to me. It's kind of overwhelming to see that. Rick at Patriot Academy, they have you sign if you go through some of their Patriot Academy stuff, the kids. So I look at that all the time. I read it all the time. Like, I get up from my desk, I stretch my legs, I'll go stand there and I'll just read a few lines or, a paragraph of it. And so I can't say I have it memorized, but I've read it through and through over and over and over. And several years back, I was reading it and I came to the words lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. This is the very end, right? Every one of us knows those words, lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. If I said lives and fortune, you would all say sacred honor. You could fill in any of those blanks. It's true for almost all Americans certainly all Americans who love America. How's that? And so I remember reading it, and it says they pledge their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. And I thought, even though I just read to that point, I thought, what are they pledging to? Because when you read something and you've read it a whole bunch of times and you know the language, your mind just sort of skims ahead, right? And so when I get there, I just kind of skim ahead. And I thought, what are they pledging to? And I went back and I reread it. And what it says, there's a reference to in the witness of divine providence, or the hand of divine providence, they're referring to God, we pledge to each other our lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. And I had never seen that before, which is really weird because I read it a lot of times. If you had asked me, I would have said, well, they pledge it to the country, or they pledge it to the flag, or they pledge it to the army. I mean, that a brand new country they had just made. Pledging life, fortune, and sacred honor to the United States of America would make perfect sense under those circumstances. Pledging it to the flag. How about Washington, right? The general of the Continental Army. All of those things would have made sense. To each other seemed odd and a little bit out of place when I first looked at it. And so over time, I started to think about what were they facing when they signed that document. That was their death warrant. Literally every one of those guys that signed that document, that was their death warrant. They had now committed treason against the king. It was probably their family's death warrant, their community's death warrant, their business's death warrant. Serious stuff. Franklin said that we have to all hang together, or most assuredly we'll hang separately. They knew what they were doing. When you live in a time like that, the idea of risk is real. And they knew that if they were going to face off against the king, against the Tories, against the power of the British Army, they needed each other. Of course, they always looked to God, and they say that, but they also knew that they would need each other. And so when they signed that paper, they looked around that room and they said, I'm going to count on you, and you can count on me. And that means a lot to me. And I read that over and over, and I tell this story very often, and I'll never stop telling this story as long as I'm in the fight, which is, for me, I say that every night. I say my prayers. I'm vigilant about saying my prayers every night before I go to bed, and I either stand in the bathroom, I'm looking in the mirror, or I lay in bed and I think I pledge my life, my fortune, and my sacred honor. And when I do it, for me, what I'm thinking of is you. And I don't mean that generically. It's easy to say, oh, I pledge my life, my fortune, and my sacred honor to all these people, the grassroots, I could say, right? For me, I've spent now 13 years traveling the United States of America and meeting people everywhere I go. People that are now part of my family. People who I will respond if they call. I often surprise people because they'll write an email to Convention of States and they're mad about something. We do a lot of stuff. That means we do stuff wrong or stuff that people disagree with. Then they'll write to me and they'll be like, oh, I think Mark Meckler was on Tucker and he said this thing that was ridiculous. And I almost always call those people personally. And I love it. Those are my favorite phone calls. They're so shocked that I called. Sometimes they've been a little mean to me. So maybe they're a little embarrassed that I'm calling, but I'm calling because I've pledged my life, fortune, and sacred honor to that person. And if they're upset with something I said, then I owe them a phone call. And sometimes I call somebody because they're in trouble and I'm trying to help. So I want you to know tonight as I close out that I've been here now. I consider you part of my family because you tolerated me for a long time, and I appreciate that. And so to you, I pledge my life, my fortune, and my sacred honor to each of you. And what that means is if you need me, you can call. You can write. I'm one guy or one organization. I can't always fix it. I'm not necessarily going to be able to help, but know that I will try. And I hope that you, when you go home tonight, will think about that and will think to yourself, are you willing to do that? Are you willing to pledge your life, your fortune, and your sacred honor to your fellow patriots? And I believe that if you do that, we are going to save the United States of America. God bless you guys. Thanks for having me tonight.
Yeah. Big round of applause, guys. Yeah. Awesome. So good. All right. You got